All Rohingyas are culprits, they're criminals, they're bad people, they're violent people, all of them. Rohingya refugee community leadership in the camps need more attention from the government, CSOs, and people of Bangladesh. We are already overloaded with court cases about or involving Bangladeshis, so we cannot deal with the access of justice for the Rohingya people. They're not a priority. Good morning to you all. Thank you very much to Mr. Mofidul Haq for the keynote speech. And it seems that he has almost covered all of the critical issues related to the topic today. I'll first highlight a few points from there where I'd like to add my comments to it, and then some other additional points. In terms of the Refugee Convention not being signed by any of the South Asian countries, and the previous speaker also spoke about how Bangladesh has shown an example of utilizing the national laws. I'll come back to that in terms of practical terms. Our Me Onİքří colleague is here as well, and some of us have actually seen in practice how it works in the camps. So I'll come back to that. But here I'd like to highlight the issue of the Global Compact on Refugees, which is a newer instrument, although it's not a convention, but a compact where 181 countries had signed, including Bangladesh, in 2018. And interestingly, at that point, US and Hungary opposed that, they did not sign, and they opposed the compact. And abstentions, there were 3 abstentions: Eritrea, Libya, and Dominican Republic. I'm not sure if that scenario has changed since 2018, but what that instrument holds is possibly some possibilities in terms of, even though within South Asia, the convention has not been signed, and of course the national laws apply, still the Global Compact on Refugees is something that still can be utilized, especially the 4 objectives: ease pressure on host communities, enhance refugee self-reliance, which could include issues of livelihood. We heard about education as well. But most importantly, 2 other points where I feel personally more close to: expand access to third country, and support conditions in countries of origin return in safety and dignity. So while in Bangladesh we talk about the return, repatriation, the issue of safety and dignity is sometimes gets a lower share. Of course, those involved do recognize that, and even the Rohingya themselves, the issue of safety and dignity and the voluntary nature of the return that is required. But often in the discussions, that is forgotten. So in terms of the alternatives, one alternative could be to advocate the use of this instrument, the Global Compact on Refugees, and bring it up as a good practice, whether it's by Bangladesh or other countries, and see what are the opportunities through that, because 181 countries did sign up to it. So when we're talking about access to justice for the Rohingya community, the signatory countries can look at the way forward in resolving the crisis, or at least easing the crisis, and the issue of accountability for Myanmar. The other point that I wanted to highlight was in the paper, Mr. Mofidul Haq mentioned that, especially on the ICC and the ICJ process, that this can take years to settle. So while it is a good example or some progress on both accounts for ICC investigation as well as the ICJ process, getting results from that in terms of accountability for Myanmar, we don't know it will happen or not, but this can take many years. So there should be other ways to hold Myanmar accountable and ensure acceptance of genocide in Myanmar and access to justice for the Rohingya community. The previous speaker spoke about the local access to justice, but in terms of the international access, that's something that still needs to be explored within this long time frame for ICC and ICJ process. And then the other point that I'd like to highlight from the paper is the Rohingya themselves. where Mr. Mufidul Haq mentioned about Rohingya refugee community leadership in the camps need more attention from the government, CSOs, and people of Bangladesh. Here I'd like to acknowledge that there was some efforts some time back when Mr. Mohibullah and his cohorts did come forward, but then he was gunned down, unfortunately. There has been a new leader we have observed very recently. His name is Dr. Zubair. He even spoke yesterday among the different gatherings that was organized yesterday in the camps. He was speaking, and the local media and others are aware that there's a new leadership coming up, but what the actors on the ground, whether it's the UN agencies, Bangladesh government, or the NGOs, it more probably for the government and the UN agencies on the ground to ensure that if such voice is coming up, the Rohingya voice, or a representation is coming up, how to ensure protection for these persons. Because there are, at the same time, people who are probably on the other side of people like Mohibullah and Mr. Zubair. So how do we ensure the protection? Of course, the protection within the camps has been discussed in the last few days or even the last year or so with these armed groups coming up. But even for the persons, they're more vulnerable probably because they're individuals who are identified and can be targeted to extreme violence. So how do you ensure their protection and even their families as well? We know that Mohibullah's family has been distraught, and perhaps they're not at the moment within the country, facilitated by US and the UN and UNHCR. So that's something that we need to be aware of. Of course, it is very important that the Rohingya voice is heard. There is, of course, the diaspora, the Rohingya diaspora, where what we have observed in the last few years that there are different factions and groups, and that's the reality. I mean, even in Bangladesh, we are often divided on different issues, whether on the political lines or, economic reform, all of that. So it's not unusual that there is differences. So there are different Rohingya diaspora groups and activists all around the world. But in the last few years, what we have experienced, we have invited them or we have heard them talk or interacted with them online or even in person. But we don't see them converging into a common strategy on addressing the critical issues either with the country where they're residing or at the international forums. So a process needs to perhaps be facilitated so that on critical issues, on positions of access to justice, these Rohingya groups can actually play a role. They haven't been making any significant mark as yet, but I feel that there is a potential to do so. I'd like to add a few other points apart from the paper, and again, thank you, Mr. Mufidul Haq, for the paper. We have to probably consider that after the military coup, there has been change, and of course, the issue that Mr. Mufidul Haq mentioned, the statement made by the National Unity Government. We hear from security analysts that the military psyche will never change, especially in Myanmar. And there's a history from 1948, not even the 60s, from 1948 till now, whether there is a democratic government or not, they do control not just the political scenario, everything, businesses, economy. So they have a very heavy presence in Myanmar. So how do you address that or deal with that? So perhaps a way to look at it might be that how does a military mind work? I mean, I know there's a security specialist on our panel as well, but from the civilian side, from the democratic side, we've had these bilateral discussions, but from a democratic government speaking to a military government or military-backed government has not really worked well. But we probably need to kind of consider that the military strategy, not necessarily the security aspect of it, but how does a government which is controlled by military see the issue of democracy, of rights, and protection of the communities. Interestingly, it was mentioned here a little bit that especially since the ICJ process and even after the military takeover, other groups, other warring groups or smaller ethnic groups have started to recognize that the Rohingyas have rights too. This is a new trend or I would say there's slightly a paradigm shift as well, that it wasn't only the authorities, it was the different communities who did not recognize the rights and protection issue of Rohingyas, which is slightly more acknowledged now. So there has to be some kind of an effort to leverage that so that whether it's the national unity government, whether they're ever able to come to power or not, and also other democratic forces, civilian groups, if there could be a process to acknowledge for good that they are the nationals of Myanmar and they have rights too and they need to be protected, because even if the actual physical transportation took place in the several efforts that were made through the bilateral process in the last few years, the reason that that got stalled, and I know that the international community is quite often blamed, including the UN agencies, that is because of them that the repatriation could not take place. But what we have seen is that on the other side of the border, there's no real sort of situation that they could return to in a life of dignity and security and other rights, right to move, right to mobility, right to work, right to education, all of that. So without all of that, it always will remain a difficult process. So if there is a change within Myanmar, and I'm not just talking about the military, but also the people of Myanmar, that they recognize and some kind of a reconciliation, that all the differences that they had when the Rohingyas were taking sides with the British, and sort of fighting with the other side, with Japan and others, that there could be a process of reconciliation, that the Rohingyas can be treated or forgiven for taking sides with the Brits, but at least they are acknowledged as their own people within the country. So it's not just the military. If there could be a process, a democratic process, or even civilian support, there could be a change that could happen. Other than that, of course, there are discussions about these international efforts, but with the political economy and the geopolitics, it's very difficult to see a way forward in that line also, although we cannot think of abandoning that. And then last but not the least, about the access to justice at the local level. In the camps in Bangladesh. Of course, the previous speaker spoke about a little bit about the practice of the Foreigners Act, but even without that, there are other laws as well which can, and even our constitution can be applied. The previous speaker spoke about it, but the reality is that the labeling and stigmatization of Rohingya, and that's a common feeling. I don't know across this room if there is that feeling or not. And for being politically correct, people may not agree that, okay, this does exist. But I see the media friends here, and I can say openly that media friends, you're not always very, out of that labeling. That all Rohingyas are culprits, they're criminals, they're bad people, they're violent people, all of them. That's the nature of language we hear. And generally, a lot of people believe that. They're all crooks, they're bad people, they need to go back. As if they have a choice. They're just staying here because they love being here. So that's kind of like a labeling. And even in Dhaka, we hear that if somebody is parking at a place where you're not supposed to park, hey Rohingya, move away, hey Shorin, hey Rohingya, Shore kan theke. So that sort of terminology has come into our vocabulary, that anybody who's occupying a space where it's not your original space is termed as a Rohingya. So that's why I say that the labeling, we have started to label, and that's a danger that within the community, rather than helping the social cohesion among the Bangladeshi and Rohingyas, we are instigating that we oppose each other. So this needs to change. So why I mention this in terms of the practice of the law, with due respect to the judicial system in Bangladesh, to our lawyers and judges, I've personally encountered this view within the justice system in Cox's Bazar, that they feel, which is partly true, that we are already overloaded with court cases about or involving Bangladeshis, so we cannot deal with the access of justice for the Rohingya people. They're not a priority. The other is that a lot of these cases, and these have come up in the media in the last few days, that so many cases are against the Rohingya about the drugs, the trafficking and all of that, the different crimes that are being committed. In the justice system, we know that you are innocent until you're proven guilty. But in Bangladesh, we don't see that always in practice. You're taken into custody on suspicion, and then you're kind of treated as a criminal in the eyes of the society. So for a lot of the Rohingyas, even if they're involved in the crime, whether it's yaba trade or trafficking, there are kingpins, there are organized groups which involve Bangladeshis. They don't run the business. They don't run the yaba business. They're sometimes carriers or sometimes forced to do so. So that's another sort of an issue in the justice system locally, that in practice, although some of our laws do apply to protect the Rohingyas, they are not always utilized within the justice system because of the mindset within the justice system that we will only prioritize Bangladeshis, not the Rohingyas. So that's something that needs to be worked on. So with that, I would like to end, and then thanks again for giving me this opportunity to speak here. Thank you very much.